Hello, and welcome to our session on diversity, equity, and insurance entitled Your Next Imperative, Embracing DEI in Insurance. I'm Darren Reffitt with Product Marketing at Guidewire Software, and I'm joined today by three esteemed panelists. Dave Ditko, who's the Managing Director of Insurance Strategy and Consulting with Accenture, Laura Pedley, who's the Managing Director with ISC Group, and Brandy Riggins, who is the head of DEI globally for Guidewire Software. And we're excited to have all three of you join us. Thank you for being here today. Dave, why don't we start with you? I'm going to ask you to just set the stage for us and talk a little bit about why this is an important issue for insurers, thinking about it from a business standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely, Darren. Thank you, and pleased to be here. So a couple of things that I would kind of highlight on this slide. So first of all, executives are thinking about inclusion and diversity. In a recent study that we partnered with a number of colleagues and industries, we saw that over 3/4 of business leaders see inclusion and diversity as a top priority. And so really that begs the question of, why now and what can this provide in terms of an opportunity? And I think the big thing that comes off this is a couple of key topics. One, we absolutely see a correlation between inclusion and diversity and improved business results. As you can see here, not only does a diverse team provide greater improvement in top and bottom line growth, but when you have more engaged employees, it absolutely provides a work environment that ultimately trickles down and creates the opportunity for growth, but also the opportunity for those to feel engaged. The other piece that I would just mention here, which I think is really interesting, and I'm sure we'll touch on later, is the importance that inclusion and diversity plays in customer loyalty. So as you'll see here, there's an interesting stat that 78% of the LGBT community would actually consider switching based on knowing that the company has, a focus on inclusion and diversity. And so I think that's a really important point as we start our conversation and we look at ways to not only think differently about what insurance needs to do, but really from a customer perspective, there's an expectation that this is part of what the fabric of a company has. And so with that, Darren, I think that kind of sets the stage in terms of, why it's important. And I think, again, how much of a focus this is as you look at, business leaders across not only insurance, but a number of industries.
Great. Thanks so much, Dave. I'd like to turn now from the business side to the more emotional side. And Brandy, why don't we start with you? Why is diversity, equity, and inclusion the right thing to do for business leaders, regardless of the numbers?
Thank you, Darren. And when I think about that question, there are four things that immediately come to mind. I think about talent, I think about innovation, I think about reputation, and most of all, I think about financial performance. So, what Dave just talked to us about is what we already know, that companies with higher levels of diversity are actually linked to lower levels of employee turnover. So, there's an actual direct correlation there. And then also, inclusive workplaces actually maximize talent and productivity. We know that organizations that are more inclusive actually have higher employee job satisfaction and a commitment to the company. Let's talk about innovation for a moment. When we think about diversity and inclusion and thinking about the things that you can't see that actually make up who we actually are, organizations with inclusive business practices, their employees view the workplace are also, they like they believe that the organization has ethical values. Consumers are more likely to purchase a product after viewing an advertisement that's perceived to be diverse or inclusive. All of the above that I just mentioned can actually affect the company's bottom line, from staffing costs due to turnover to actually improve performance due to customers.
Great. Laura, is there anything you'd like to add for that one?
For me, I think the only thing I'll add, and it really echoes Dave's point of longevity when we first kicked off the session, was To me, it's about giving a sense of community to employees within an organization, a feeling of belonging, and that all adds to the mental well-being of our employees. And that, as we all know, over the last 12 months has been front of mind as well.
Laura, why don't we continue with you on the next question? There's been a lot of focus in the US on the importance of social justice and inequality for very good reason over the last year. But I know those same issues exist to various degrees in other countries. Can you share a little bit with us about what's been going on in the European markets and how that relates to what's going on here in the US?
Yeah, so for us here in the London market, we there was a sort of a pivotal moment 2 years ago when a Bloomberg article was released about Lloyd's of London and some of the challenges of working in that market. It came to light in quite a intrusive way, I'd say, but it did make everyone step back for a minute. That shock factor that an article like that was written and released without warning, it created that shock factor, and it meant that everyone took a step back and said, look, we need to stop saying we're doing something about it and actually start doing something about it, changing it from words to action. And so I've been working in the DE&I space for the last 5 years, but for me in London, that 2 years ago, that was the point in which everyone started making pledges. We're holding ourselves accountable, and here 2 years on, we're monitoring that success. And if it hasn't had any changes in certain organization, that will be questioned. And I think that is something really key to have come out of something so bold. But likewise, the Black Lives Matter movement that happened last year had a huge impact in the London market in terms of the ethnic pay gap that is there. It's just not reported. And so a number of our clients that we're working with at the moment have undergone huge campaigns, really set by Zurich, who were the first in the London market to collect the data and report the data without any guidelines as to how to do that. And so we held a roundtable with them about 4 months ago now, educating the insurance companies in the London market about how do you collect that data. There's no hard feelings, you don't have that data. Let's start collecting it. Let's create a benchmark, and together we can make change. So we're really starting to make moves now in our gender pay gap here in London, our ethnic pay gap. And what I'd really like to see is that we carry that those procedures and that data collection and really carry the other diversities along with it. So talking about the LGBTQ plus community, but also neurodiversity, that's front of mind for us as well at the moment.
What do you see as the effects that will be faced by firms that fail to respond to those changes and aren't thinking about that at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Darren. And as I think about what's really facing insurance carriers here in North America, I mean, there's no shortage of challenges that they have. So you look at the amount of growth or lack thereof that I think has hit the personal lines market here in North America, with the exception of a handful of carriers. Most carriers are really struggling to see more than just incremental growth year over year. There's also a ton of cost pressure as well coming in, interest rates being low, but also just operating more efficiently. And so when you look at those two things, plus what I like to call the whole concept of customer expectations being shaped outside of insurance, and I think there just being a greater focus on needing to be civically responsible. If insurance companies aren't really responding, when you look at the fact that they're already not growing and they're looking at ways to take cost out of the organization, they could be at a point where, financially, they're going to continue to see their bottom lines being impacted. And so that's why, as I talk with clients and as we see our clients, thinking about ways to look for alternative revenue sources, it's not just about how can we go after the markets that we've traditionally gone after, because at this point, I think a lot of those, what I would consider Main Street markets have already been pretty well tapped. Really what it comes down to is looking at different ways to engage, looking at different ways to bring either areas of our population that haven't necessarily been thought of into the conversation. And I think that's really a unique opportunity that insurance carriers really have, because It's not that that market certainly doesn't exist. I think it's really an opportunity to kind of really focus on how can we go after this market with the right messaging and really use that as an opportunity to address what could be, a rather dire situation that insurance carriers are currently facing.
So, Laura, the ISC has been focused on driving retention, attraction, and promotion for women in the insurance industry for over a decade with great success. Can you share some of the strategies that insurers have used to address the gender gap that might be transferable to either other cultural groups or the LGBTQ community or others?
Absolutely. So, as I said, I've been working in the space for 5 years, and seeing what organizations were doing 5 years ago versus now is quite incredible. So, the first one I would say is all around the hiring techniques. We hear it every single day, but trying to get as much unconscious bias out of those hiring techniques as possible is step one. And that's actually something that they can do, well, organizations can do quite easily. There's programs there's CV admitting tools. There's all of this software out there that you can use to take any unconscious bias out of those CVs. I mean, years of experience. We love that in the London market. If you don't have X, Y, and Z years of experience in insurance, you don't make the cut. That was one of the first things to go, because we want to attract people from outside the insurance industry. So why was that still there? Degree. You don't need a certain degree. You need an interest. You need to show what skills you have and how they can be applied to the job role that you're going for, rather than a checkbox exercise. So we did that. I'd say we're pretty good on that, especially in diversifying the talent we're bringing in at the younger generation, so entry level. But something that we're still tackling at the moment, and I'm not going to say we've done a good job on it yet, but it is front of mind, is how to attract more experienced and more senior diverse talent into the insurance industry. So we're looking at that at the moment, and I personally feel like we need to do a huge marketing plug about the stability of the insurance industry. I mean, we've survived a pandemic. We weren't a furloughed industry, and that's actually been seen in the universities here in London, that it's made an insurance more attractive as a career choice. So how do we translate that across the industries and really start to tap into all of the exciting things that we have coming up in the insurance industry and bring that talent along with us? So those are kind of the thing, that's the thought process, but that all comes from leadership. And this comes, I said it in my comment before, but this comes from the leaders actually doing things, holding themselves accountable, saying that they aren't where they would like to be, and then creating an action plan from there. And I think that's really crucial in all of this.
Great, thank you. Let's shift to similar topic, which is banking versus insurance. Brandy, having come to the insurance side from working in banking at Bank of America, Wells Fargo, I think it's safe to say that banking is a little ahead of insurance, and part of that was driven by regulatory issues, right? Undercovering instances of redlining, really dealing with predatory lending practices and things like, bringing banking to the unbanked. But with that in mind, with your years of experience there, what lessons can insurers learn from banks on how to really embrace and not only internally but externally diversity for their workforce and in their customer base?
Sure. So one of the things that I think that the banks have done is that they've realized that there's not a one size fits all approach to how they actually work with the lines of businesses. And let me explain what I mean by that. What they're doing is they're actually taking individual diversity and inclusion practitioners and they're aligning them to business leaders. That way, that person is completely immersed within the business and they could drive DEI with a specific lens, whether it be on sales, product development, or business solutions, but they know all the ins and outs of D&I and they can help bring the leader along the way. From an external standpoint, what I see a lot of banks doing, JP, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, they are going in and actually creating diverse segment roles. And these roles are pretty cool in the sense that they interface primarily with the community. They are focused specifically on the actual markets. And I'll give you an example. So with the LGBTQ plus community, there's actually managers that are aligned to that specific diversity dimension to specifically go in and sell and contract with that particular dimension. And that's also helpful because what they do is they engage the employee resource groups. And in the case of both Bank of America and Wells Fargo, that group was called Pride, to actually help them cater what they're doing and the types of programs that they're bringing to the actual market. Another thing that I saw that was really interesting that we don't talk about a lot is neurodiversity. How do we work with neurodiverse associates? And those are people who have Asperger's, autism, ADHD, who do really well in environments that are very structured. They're creating programs like that to bring in different dimensions of diversity, which also affects accessibility. And then two, they're looking at returnship. They're looking at working moms. They're looking at people who've been out of the workforce for quite some time and then figuring out how to get them engaged because they already know the product, they already know the company, they already know the culture. But how can I go in and re-engage those people and bring them back? And that's also a less cost on training. And the last thing that I think that they're doing that's really effective is they're tying it to compensation. So all the three companies that I mentioned, what they're actually doing is they're putting specific goals around diversity and inclusion, and it's actually tied to the executive's compensation in regards to bonus. Now, there's different ways that they do it, but in a nutshell, it's starting to help the needle move, which is why all those other things have been put in place to further push along the effort.
Well, what gets measured and what gets compensated generally does get done. Laura, is there anything you'd like to add?
I would. And Brandy, I love the fact that you mentioned neurodiversity because the insurance industry is so catered to accommodate all the different diversities, especially when we look at all of the different areas of the industry. And that's actually something we've been working with an organization called GAIN on, which was launched this year through the pandemic, which is all about bringing neurodiverse talent into the insurance industry. So hopefully they can take some learnings from the banks as well. But what I was going to comment on here was around the returnship piece, and the banks have actually done something I haven't seen tried in insurance yet to try and make sure that anyone coming back from a period of leave, whether it be 3 months or a full 12 months, is making sure that that individual is still on their career trajectory. So the banks I've seen have done this before an individual going off leave, sort of mapped that out and enabled individuals to carry on with their peers within the organization and get a promotion when they may not even be in the office. Now, there's quite a lot of communications that needs to come around with that to make sure that it's a fair process. But if the individual has been in the organization for 10 years, what better case studies do you have to showcase that that individual deserves that promotion or is on track? You have all of that data, so why not use it and make that individual feel valued and rewarded when they get back to the office, not feel like they're 2 steps back to where their peers are.
Dave, it looked like there was something you wanted to add.
Yeah, I guess the only other piece that I would just comment on is, I think technology is also an area where insurers can learn a little bit from banks. And it's unfortunate that it's probably not necessarily a positive lesson, but I think certainly something that, as insurance carriers, they certainly need to be aware of. We talked a lot about this concept of ethical artificial intelligence. And I think Brandy or, Laura, you both mentioned kind of the concept of unconscious bias and kind of how that plays into certainly the way that, we operate. One of the, I think, areas that you can certainly take a learning from the banks is in terms of how technology was being used in certain ways to actually discriminate against certain types of lenders when trying to, hand out mortgages in their underwriting process. And so if you kind of think about that in the context of insurance, technology like artificial intelligence has been around for years, and insurance carriers are absolutely, very, very much leaning in and looking at that for ways to improve their operations. So I think it's going to be really important that as technology such as artificial intelligence continues to be, become more and more prevalent, that insurance carriers are really looking at that not only as a way to improve how they do business, but not lose sight of the fact that there are some unintended consequences that could essentially happen if the right processes aren't in place on the front end to ensure that those doing the coding, have gone through unconscious bias training and they're thinking about kind of the ethics associated with it. So I think it complements, what both Laura and Brandy were saying, but just kind of thinking or kind of adding that as just another dimension, if you will, as to what we can learn, Darren.
That's a great segue point, Dave. The last question I'm going to ask is around go-to-market and how our skills and abilities and the diversity that we have on our team affects that. One of my favorite examples of the importance and need for diversity in go-to-market strategy is YouTube, as it was launching its iOS app, realized that 10% of the videos were coming in upside down. And no one on the team could figure out why, because none of the team was left-handed. And obviously those unconscious bias gaps can be hugely impactful on communities if there's no one from that community on there, just because a lack of knowledge leads to a lack of transparency, leads to products that don't necessarily meet the needs. So what kind of gaps are insurers likely to face if they fail to increase the diversity on their teams? And Laura, why don't we start with you on this one?
Yeah, I'd love to. And Dave stole my answer. Well, Semi stole my answer, because I was going to talk about AI. And obviously, there's so many different reasons why a diverse workforce is not only great for your organization, but makes it more profitable. But for me, and the new phase, I spoke about this in one of my other answers, is that the insurance industry is about to go through a huge automation process. Technology, I truly believe we're going to tackle technology and integrate it into our business over the next few years. And in order to make sure that those processes and all of that AI is as unconscious as we can make it, so that it's delivering fair pricing, we need to not only ensure that everyone who is coding those machines has gone through unconscious bias training, but is diverse, is completely representative of the society that we live in. Because as much training as we can go through, we're still learning all about the unconscious biases that we have. And so for me, it's about the training, but it's also about getting the diversity of coders. And that's a challenge in itself.
Brandy, why don't we go to you so that Dave doesn't steal your answer too?
So as I thought about what both Dave and Laura were saying, I also thought about accessibility. So when you have a site, a marketing site, a product site, how accessible is it for consumers to use if they have diverse abilities? And if you don't have anyone on your team who, as Laura stated, can code to that, or who knows exactly what to look for, even the use of colors that we use on marketing campaigns or even on the actual website, there may be a customer that may not choose to go with that insurer just because of the accessibility options that they have for the site and for the product that they're trying to actually use. So that's one of the things that come to mind when I think about that question.
And Dave.
Yeah, I think both Laura and Brandy's answers were fantastic. The only thing I would just add is, I think there's an opportunity as you look at the products to really revisit how products are being sold, the language around the products that are being sold. Because, like it or not, I think products today are marketed at kind of the masses, and the masses aren't necessarily reflective of what really our country is all about anymore. And so I think there really is an opportunity for insurance carriers to kind of look within and take a hard look at their language that has been in place for some companies for 50, 70 years, because these are legally binding contracts that a lot of times we don't necessarily take the time to actually go through a policy that could be pages and pages long. But there's probably a lot in there that certainly could use a refresh, and I think certainly could benefit from I think just perhaps marketing and ultimately offering what are still very comprehensive products differently, given everything that we've talked about today.
Great, thank you so much. On behalf of Guidewire, I'd just like to thank all of you for joining us today for this panel. For those of you watching, I hope you found some valuable insights, and we look forward to having you join us at future editions of Connections Reimagined as we continue to explore the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion on the insurance industry. Thanks and have a great day.